I can't get over how fortunate I am to call this my job. It didn't start out so glamorous, but nowadays I feel like our message is finally getting out there, just seeing just the recognition amongst peripheral trades, peripheral professionals within the community. I hear some of the conversations held, and it's at a very high level. I think people are coming to appreciate the importance of trees finally, particularly in the urban context, and tonight's all about getting more of them in the ground. So as you see, I brought some samples with me. I'm going to get to talking about them at some point, and I noticed there was the seedling there. I recognized that from the display at Canadian Tire on Hillside. Yeah, and that's one more element. Just like I'm encouraged that's the trend, but I feel like it's also never been harder to get trees in the ground, even as they become more available, more affordable. There's these opposing forces that are preventing us from actually getting trees established. Particularly large at maturity trees such as Douglas firs here. So that segues nicely into a bit of an experiment I have on that note of the difficulty of getting these trees out there and in the ground. I guess I would hypothesize that I'm probably going to end up taking all of these trees home, which is sort of the challenge. The nuance, the specifics we're looking for trees in situations, trees are readily available. In this case, I'm a grower myself. I grow trees for purposes like this, but also just as an educational opportunity and then distributing them to friends and family and so on. But it's really hard to get these things out of my greenhouse and out into the ground where we need them most, where they can get established. So do I have any takers? So we've got native species, we've got a fine specimen, snakebark maple there. We've got a food staple, a sweet chestnut, as well as Arbutus.
Find a taker for you.
Yeah. And most of these trees get fairly big at maturity. There's a wee western red cedar seedling that's just popped up from this year, and then a smaller Arbutus. So I've dug all these up actually. I got home late from work and wanted to do some samples, but wasn't quite sure where I was going to go with it. But this is what I ended up with. Just pulled these out of my little nursery at home and root washed them, so we can have a look at the roots, and we'll talk a little bit more about these different species and where we can integrate them. With that said, I wanted to kind of talk about the story of an urban tree and how it goes. And I don't think many people recognize the challenge of a tree reaching maturity, a large open canopy tree, particularly in the denser sections of the community. From a seed, which now is a great time to be collecting seed for those that are into propagation, from a seed, we're going to require a period of dormancy for the seed before it'll produce a root radical. It'll sprout a tiny root radical and begin to get established in its soils at that point. From that point, we'll get the beginning of a vegetative shoot, a cotyledon, and you'll just see two simple leaves at that point if it's a dicotyledon. From there, it'll put on its true leaves, and this is usually not until about spring, early summer. From there, you'll get incremental growth after one season. We're talking maybe species dependent. This is a perfect example here. This western red cedar, it formed its cotyledon probably would have been June, would have started to sprout above the soil, and here's 1 year from seed being produced off the tree and going through its dormancy period. All which to say, it takes time. From year 1 into year 2, I've got a perfect example of a year 2 Arbutus seedling. Not a lot of growth. Takes its time. Any guesses on the age of this one, Arbutus?
4 years.
Exactly. So not a lot of growth. Now, take that tree out of a container and put it in the ground. This same crop for which this container tree came from. I stuck one in my front yard on the municipal easement, and it is put on over 1 meter of growth in 1 year. It is a full, almost 1.5 meters taller than that seedling. Same seed crop, same year. So it's all about getting it into soils, and they'll take off. Even if the soils are less than ideal, a lot of the species we have to work with, particularly when they're young, produced from seed, they have amazing resilience, ability to endure stress and still get established and take off quickly. But in container environment, in nursery environment, they can be quite slow to establish. So from year 2, we have a short little seedling. To the point from that tiny little arbutus to the point where we have caliper stock that we could use for city purposes, putting in a boulevard or in a park, we can be talking upwards of 10 years. So all of which, if you could wrap your head around some of the species selection dilemmas we're facing now with a changing climate and not having a lot of research on hand to consider suitable species for the modeled predictions, getting nurseries to adapt and produce stock that's going to be available to plant is difficult, and has about a 5 to 10 year window before we can obtain stock and actually get plants in the ground. So that's just one of the challenges, and from that point, once we're established, much of what I see in the urban context is a lot of conflict with trees from the point they go into the ground, whether they're social conflicts, whether it's physical conflicts with vehicle traffic, panel van pruning, if you want to call it that, deer, the notorious deer, and breaking trees in half or stripping off all the foliage, increasing drought conditions in summer and winter, storm events, heavy wet snow. There's just myriad of potential conflicts with a tree. For a tree to make it from establishment to medium height, medium crown spread, there's a lot working against it, if you can imagine. So yeah, we need to take every opportunity to get them in the ground.
And keep the ones we have, right?
Yeah, yeah. A big part of the challenge is what, if you look into recent history, what those trees have endured, and ultimately where we have large wounds created and decay introduced, a lot of time the option is not great either way. So I think it's important that we pass that message forward, that we don't miss opportunities to provide that level of care. We recognize that these things can't necessarily take care of themselves in some of the placements we stick them into, that they need a little bit of intervention to make sure that we're going to have them for the long haul. And we don't make the mistakes we've made in the past where we just abandon care and hope for the best. Yeah, so before I talk my brains completely out, I'll just say I'd like to keep this collaborative. Any questions you have as we go, or if I trigger a thought or something you want to share, I really like rolling that way. So
I wonder about trees, being planted along streets, which is great, but that's not how trees normally grow. They don't grow in a row.
It's an important point.
And they grow in a group, and they have, as we know now, they have underground communication systems, and they help each other to hang in there.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So the question or comment was more or less saying that the situations we plant these in, particularly on streets, don't represent what the trees have come up with naturally. It's a bit of an artificial environment. It doesn't have much in the way of biodiversity when you consider symbiotic relationships between fungi and soil microbes, understory plants, and so on. And that is the reality. And it's amazing what trees can endure. You go downtown and see these tiny little concrete pits, and somehow they've endured just unbelievable adversity. Struck by vehicles multiple times, still putting on wound wood, still putting on good growth every year, and they're amazingly tolerant and adaptable. It's all about minimizing the stress, though. So we can use them in some tricky spots, but I think it's important that we take more opportunities to get out of the status quo, and the research is very clear. It's all about soil volumes and integrating other species and creating healthy soil environments where trees can thrive and endure harsher conditions.
So can you talk more to creating healthy soil then?
Yeah, I don't want to jump too far ahead because that's.
Okay, sorry.
That's a really good introduction. It's just we're taking trees that are adapted to a completely different environment, a forest environment in many cases, or where they are wide and open grown, and then we stick them in this situation where they've got a 1.2 meter wide boulevard and hope for the best.
Have you found a lot of difference between different species and the amount of permeable ground that is available to them? So, for example, in a boulevard situation, do some species do particularly poorly because there's concrete all around, fairly close to the tree, and others are more tolerant of that?
Yeah, there's a lot of information on hand to inform planting in specific to soil volumes, and more generally, you could narrow it down to species growth rates. Fast-growing trees that produce a lot of girth will have a great deal of root mass and will basically absorb all the rooting space. They'll fill the space sooner than slower-growing trees. That's a bit of a simplification, but it's an easy way to narrow it down. But we are well aware of species not to use in concrete pits, 4x4 pits in particular. But that's...
You're well aware of... Could you repeat that? I didn't quite catch it.
Sorry. We are well aware of which species that are not suitable for like downtown planting pits in hardscape environments, for example. Through trial and error in some cases, but there's been a lot more research that's come online about species adaptability for the region in those types of configurations.
So do you have a list, for example, of better tree species to plant where, say, somebody might have a smaller garden without the root space, or where roots may damage foundations eventually? Is there such a list available?
There are, regionally, I would say this is a really good opportunity to establish a relationship with a arboricultural professional, tree care service provider, but also municipalities. Some municipalities will provide that information to the public on suitable species for the area and species to avoid. Generally, the species to avoid are those that frequently create conflict with perimeter drains, for example, in some cases foundations.
Create conflict with?
Perimeter drains.
Right.
We got like some acoustic challenges here. Perimeter drain conflict, as well as disturbance of hardscape, heaving of patio stones, that sort of thing. We know which species are prone to that.
Which are those?
I mean, I think probably the key culprits we're aware of. Red maple is somewhat notorious, but unfortunately it's also one of the most adaptable. Like, you can stick it in really awful soils. It's very commonly seen in parking lots. Landscape architects love it for really tough siting conditions, hostile, mixed lighting conditions, poor soils, droughty soils, can tolerate poorly draining soils. It can have wet feet. So it's very adaptable, but trade-off is prone to heave surfaces, And yeah.
With native trees as opposed to not native trees?
I don't really have hard and fast opinions on one or the other. I love native plants. I do a lot of work with native plants. I'm not, I wouldn't say I side with one or the other, and I think there are, within the species we have to work with, I think there's some great tools to work within an urban context. Gary oak is amazingly resilient, tough, we're pretty fortunate to have examples of Gary oak in the area. Urban trees that predate the arrival of European settlers. Like, you can walk up and touch a tree that's been through just an enormous amount of history in an urban setting. Like, how many cities can you point to that have had that opportunity? Unfortunately, people haven't really made that connection, but I think it's really important and demonstrates the resilience. Like, they've just been through development and climate changes more recently. They're very drought tolerant, adaptable to excavation injury. You see where roads have gone in and done just enormous damage, and still they're stable and still put on decent growth and overcome the wounding. Like Douglas fir is another fantastic example. You can use them in certain siting conditions, rocky outcrop where soils are thin and they get established, and they can provide overstory to allow understory communities to build. So giving you options in restoration, but they also work really incredibly well in, beside a house. They're very rarely do we see whole tree failures. You'll see small branch failures. On occasion, most of the issues we find with Douglas fir are those that have been pruned poorly, where they've been topped in the past and decay has been introduced. Arbutus, I'm blown away at the potential for the species. A lot of people are quite concerned that they see the foliar blight, they see the canker, they see a lot of Arbutus dying, but there's also examples I can point to, like downtown Victoria, where these trees have just perfect structure, not a spot of blight on them, doing fantastic, considering the pollution impacts, compaction impacts, minimal soil volumes. So I think we should be incorporating them more often.
What is it about this coast that, because they're only found on this coast, aren't they, Robert?
Arbutus? Arbutus, the range extends from Northern California up past Nanaimo on the east shore.
Yeah,
They
it
don't,
goes as far as Desolation Sound and
Yeah.
a little further
Yep.
on occasion. And I was going to ask you if there has been, to your knowledge, any noticeable creep in range northwards along the coast of Arbutus. I used to live in Desolation Sound, so I know that when I first went there in the 70s, we could skate up Refuge Lagoon, the whole 2.5 miles, for about 2 weeks in winter. And as of a few decades ago, it decreased where you couldn't skate at all, and now it's a rare winter that you get anything more than a little horizontal line out from the edge of the lake. So I was thinking of that as the possible indication of warming, and therefore perhaps allowing the Arbutus to extend their range. Do you know if there's been any study done on that?
I can't say if there has, or it hasn't come across my radar, and I have to be clear, my expertise is in the urban context. Right. That would be a question more for the forestry research side, I would think, but our communities are loosely connected, and I think I have much more of an awareness of what's going on with Western red cedar than Arbutus, as far as the range creeping northward. But I haven't seen any recent research that has made that conclusion. That's not to say it isn't there. Again, like I'm narrowing my focus here. I'm much more in tune to what goes on in urban forestry.
I have a question about Arbutus, urban Arbutus. Is that something that, do you water them or do they like drought?
They are one of the most drought-resilient species we have to work with. You'll see them established on rocky outcrop in just really hostile conditions. They get a foothold, and again, they can be a really useful tool for natural areas restoration and protecting those the soils from the harsh sun, wind, and erosion from heavy rainfall. So an important tool that maybe we're not utilizing, but there's also not a great deal of nursery availability of Arbutus. I think a lot of people have written it off. It's not a very popular species. And then those that are in restoration work, I've heard repeatedly, finding stock for their own needs is next to impossible. Small numbers are available here and there of smaller stock, but it can be quite a tricky species to grow. And the nurseries are always looking at what's cost effective for them as well. So anything that's really difficult, finicky, where they incur a lot of losses, then maybe they're not going to put too much time into it.
It's tricky to grow, yet it's resilient. That's
Yeah.
That's like, I don't get it.
Yeah. That's from a nursery perspective. Yes, it is. It's prone to damping off. So at an established level, you incur a lot of losses at an early stage. It's a bit more intensive to get from seed to seedling, and from there, it's a slow process to get to a height where it's marketable. But from seed, the other issue is if you were to establish, put that out in the open, the deer will clean it off pretty quickly, so it needs adequate protection early on.
Up the old Island Highway, there is a stand of absolutely magnificent, unusually straight and vertical Arbutus, and they're absolutely massive, and they look so different. There's a stand of them in what looks like relatively deep and rich soil, and they don't look like any Arbutus that I've seen anywhere else.
Yeah.
Because they're so massive. I couldn't tell you the height that they've grown to.
Yeah.
But that sort of indicates to me that there may be quite a few species, perhaps other than Arbutus, that might do better with some care than they, in their placement than is usually afforded.
That's a perfect segue for we should get in and talk about placement. Placement is the number one challenge for looking at an urban context. I hear over and over again, "Oh, planting a tree is the easy part." Like, it couldn't be harder. It's so hard. The amount of brain power that goes to getting one boulevard tree in the ground is enormous. There's so many people impacted now. There's a little wiggly worm here. Uh-oh. There's so many stakeholders invested in the process in a municipal capacity, but even now I've experienced more and more frequently where trees go in on private property. The stakeholders are the neighbors and can take an interest in an awful hurry when they see one of these go in the ground. They feel, the perceptions of large trees are something we really struggle with. People see large tree and they see risk. They see, a potential drop in their property value or impacts to their views and so on.
Why a drop in property value?
That's perception. It hasn't. That's been heavily researched, and they found that established mature trees on a property actually improve property values. That one's been beaten to death, we know, and it's brings up property values in entire neighborhoods. The presence of mature trees, large trees in particular.
What about unusual trees like the sequoia? We have a few in the city.
Yeah, we have many.
How did they manage to flourish or remain here?
It was a different time. Large parcels of land, and that was the that was kind of the landscape planning of the time, is the use of these dominant overstory plants. They were new to the population. They were unique. A lot of them were donated from the governor of California in around 1880, and they all went in around Rockland, in Beacon Hill, right around the same time in James Bay, by New Horizons there at Irving Park. You'll notice there's a very large gap between that age group and every other sequoia in the city. So in that era, lots of them went in the ground, and then everybody said no thanks.
There's a really big one on Can and Kincaid, and you can't even see the house behind it because it's on a small front lawn, but
Yeah.
they haven't pruned it, so it's beautiful shape all through the wires and everything.
Yeah, that's one species I'd love to do more with. I think it gives us some tools, just looking from a carbon sequestration standpoint. Rapid growing, puts on just simply amazing wood volume, root mass, biomass in a short period of time. Could be very useful in restoration projects despite being non-native. It could be useful for remediation projects, stormwater capture, capturing airborne pollutants, so on.
What if you have a new park? And would it be a good idea to introduce something like that to a new park? And knowing it'll take a while to prosper, right?
Well, you'd be surprised. In 20 years, that thing will be 60 feet tall and probably, close to 4 feet at the base.
Thrive.
It would, yeah. They do very well here, but there's resistance from other user groups often with the tree. Yep. Well, even there, views are impacted a lot of the time. People get very upset with the idea of towering trees. Sadly, if I could have more huge trees, I'd be all up. Sign me up tomorrow. Let's do it. But it's all about perceptions. People see tall trees, they see risk, and we have that data as well. You can't make that conclusion. Trees are, compared to you walking out the door and walking onto the street, the number one risk in the community is your exposure to vehicles. These trees are inherently safe, particularly where we have a staff monitoring them periodically and catching those defects and providing care.
What are the things we do wrong when we're planting trees?
I would say probably one of the larger issues is not thinking in 4 dimensions, thinking space-time continuum, imagining where this tree ends up in 10 years and 20 years and 50 years, and how that can creep up on you and have impacts on your own use of the property, but again, other users and how they interact with your property. So engaging others is another issue, I think, where we have shortcomings, and informing them that this is not necessarily a risk, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's hard work, that's heavy lifting. It's convincing others that it's a benefit to them. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can tell me your familiarity and experience with the Polonia in Beacon Hill Park. When were they planted? How did they do? Were there any problems with them in terms of the care and that sort of thing? And I assume that all the ones there are tomentosa and none of the other 19 to 23
cultivars?
Species of them that are, nobody seems to be able to decide just about how many there are.
Is that also known as the Empress Splendor too?
Empress tree, or
Right,
yeah,
okay.
Polonia, yep.
Right.
So I can speak at length about Polonia tomentosa. We've been fielding a lot of questions about this species more recently, It's been picked up on the radar on its, I guess it punches above its weight in terms of carbon sequestration and nitrogen fixing. And those benefits have been touted through various resources, and more recently we've been fielding a lot of questions about it as a potential candidate in rapid implementation to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change. The sad news with the species, it's where conditions are suitable, growing conditions are suitable, the species thrives, but it is also often outcompeting native species and outcompeting a lot of introduced species, and has quite an invasive potential both through seed or with the seedless cultivars of the species through suckering. Given good growing conditions, it takes off, it grows in a hurry, but it also casts a wide net and can create enormous challenges.
Have you had that experience in Beacon Hill Park?
Of invasive tendencies? No, because the growing conditions here on the South Island are not favorable for the Paulownia at this time.
Well, from what I know, you have to go down to places like Indiana before you get really invasive behavior.
Yeah, so the questions I've been fielded that have been put to me on Paulownia are on the basis of, well, the modeling is suggesting we're going to be looking at conditions that are favorable for this tree to produce these carbon sequestration potential benefits. Well, if those conditions do arrive, as will the invasive tendencies, I would speculate, with this species. But there's more to the story just than the invasive issue. The tree does not have good growing conditions here and doesn't tend to thrive. It's also prone, its wood is somewhat weak and is prone to branch failures, which represents a lot of maintenance challenges for cities.
Any branch failure in Beacon Hill? And I'm not aware of it. Any branch failure of the tomentosa that's on the ledge lawn?
Yeah, I haven't provided management to the one at the legislature. I haven't, the one that was planted at Beacon Hills before my time, so I can't say whether it's had past failures or not. My experience with the species on the lower mainland of Vancouver Island is that it is prone to failures, particularly in wet snow load events, and that those large wounds created from large primary branch failures do not, it's a poor compartmentalizing species, so you end up with decay in those areas, creating weakness at poor points in the structure, creating long-term management issues. So it's a species that you could use in certain siting, but it would not be a good candidate as a boulevard tree. And
no, because it requires lots of space. The word is that you need in radius from the trunk 12 to 15 feet of permeable ground, and so on. So no, I think it would be a lousy candidate.
so this is a really good snapshot of the type of conversation that goes with any species selection. I think this is a perfect case. Like, you've got these trees that present these obvious benefits and maybe tools for certain conditions. It demonstrates great pest resilience. It is drought tolerant. It grows quickly but doesn't go beyond a certain height at maturity. But trade-off, allergen impacts to public health, potential for branch failure in mild loading events, wind or wet weather.
You've heard of allergen effects of this?
I'm not talking about Paulownia in this case. I'm talking about the broader challenge of species selection. And narrowing our viewpoint on one silver bullet tree is unlikely, and it will have impacts on our biodiversity goals as well. So going all in on one species we've seen time and again how that's worked out with emerald ash, with Dutch elm, with Asian longhorn beetle. Yeah, and one thing that isn't talked about as much is you look at these recent weather events in Halifax with Hurricane Dorian, and Winnipeg with Snowmageddon, and Calgary in 2014, similar event, ice storm in Toronto. You see similar species that have these prone to failures in certain points. You'll see the entire species takes a whack and gets hit really hard. So that's why it's important to manage your biodiversity in the urban forest. Yeah.
I think I heard recently that some trees fare better if there's actually a fire. Certain species.
Yep. Well, it's difficult to produce that in the urban context, but City of Toronto is doing it. They've, I'm trying to remember the species of oak they're working with. I think it's black oak. They have, within High Park, they have some intact restoration works ongoing that they're using fire as a tool. This species, the overstory species, the oaks, demonstrate great resistance to fire. It controls very effectively and efficiently invasive species and opens up that seed bank of native species and can restart the process. So it's intriguing, yeah.
The giant sequoia is very fire resistant, but it takes fire for the seed pod to open. Is that
Yeah,
sort of what
yeah. Well, there's other ways to recreate it through scarification, but yeah, naturally, that's.
So I have a question about our list of protected trees is kind of very limited, and I'm thinking, should we be thinking about what trees are going to capture carbon and be the right tree? And have a list of those. I mean, the tree preservation bylaw is being renewed, and we're in a very different time right now where we have to think in a different way about how we protect trees and what we plant. As you know, that's why you're here. But what are good trees for carbon capture that people are more likely to think that's the tree for me in my part?
So squaring our focus onto carbon capture or carbon sequestration, that's the question. So before I answer that question, it's a great question, recognizing how people interact with trees, but also biodiversity, also using it in utilitarian purposes for carbon capture or stormwater capture, attenuation, so on. Like there's just an enormous crossroads here. So do we want to go all in on this carbon capture idea? Yeah, sure, but can we have our cake and eat it too? Or can we, I think it's so intriguing, the planning opportunities, how we integrate these elements in our urban forest, because I think we can have little sections of our parks that may be just heavyweights of stormwater capture, carbon sequestration. Like I look to the cottonwoods in Beacon Hill and like, let's expand this concept and do a little restoration beneath them, because there's just enormous carbon stored in there. Although it's, cottonwood will decay quite rapidly as it does age out, but maybe integrating other species. But recognizing how people interact with trees and what people are still fighting tooth and nail for aesthetic reasons.
In good conditions, what is the average age of cottonwood in this area? I wouldn't choose to simplify that. In urban conditions, they can be, foresters will commonly call them a short-lived tree, but there's examples where they're over 100 years old. So define short-lived. There's some very old cottonwoods, Fraser Valley, heading up towards Port Renfrew. There's just
very, very old cottonwoods out there, so I wouldn't simplify it in those terms. But
Say similar to Bologna, then. Their average age is supposedly 100 years, with the oldest one noted so far with 130.
yeah, although if we're leaning on carbon sequestration, cottonwood vastly outperforms Paulownia locally, and will for some period of time.
What about nitrogen fixation?
I don't want to fixate too much on Paulownia. It's really it's a really in-depth topic. I think we could spend an entire session on it. I'm encouraged that you've taken such an interest in the species, and I think we really need to analyze in an urban context a lot of the species that we've been working with up until now, and looking at the modeling and what's going to work. But again, narrowing our focus on carbon sequestration alone misses a big piece of the puzzle and how people engage with their urban forest. And I think it'll cost us some capital if we tune out all those interests and focus entirely on carbon sequestration. Yes, the situation is urgent. We need to get trees in the ground. But just thinking on an environmental scale and less of an anthropocentric scale, we're not including associated species that have co-evolved with native species in the carbon sequestration conversation. That's just one element of it. Species that integrate with introduced tree species, we're not considering those values in a carbon sequestration angle. So that's not to disregard the importance of the carbon sequestration challenge, but it's just to think big picture. We need those elements, and we need to get them in the ground fast. However, we're not going to be able to place those where people interact with the trees. We're not going to be able to put them where the density levels are highest. Downtown, we're in a housing crisis. We hear this in lockstep with we're in a climate crisis. So I refuse to believe it's a dichotomy, but we need to get serious about integrating and connecting people with trees in those dense areas.
Do you have any ideas about how we can keep trees in the downtown core with infill housing?
Yeah, it's all about soil volume. So a lot of these modular soil cell configurations, the Silva cell being probably the most widely known. They're tremendously expensive, but
So I don't really understand what happens underground downtown. Is there a room for trees to go like under the street and they can't go under the buildings that are, but now like we're seeing excavations that go right from the sidewalk straight down 30 feet or something, so clearly the tree cannot grow there, but under the street can they grow, or is there just a little cave for them to grow?
the majority of downtown trees are in concrete coffins, 4x4, and they're filled with structural soil. So they should be provided in the neighborhood of 12 cubic meters of soil, but they're provided more like 3 to 4 meters of soil volume because it's structural soil, which only has a small percentage of growing medium within it. The rest is aggregate. So it's getting even less soil. It's worst of the worst, but that's meant to mitigate potential impacts for rooting. Now the soil cell configuration expands the underground available soil volume vastly. You can define, whatever space you have underneath the hard surface could be a soil container. They're just hollow engineered pieces of plastic that can support road weights as a concrete cap or an asphalt cap on top of it. So you have uncompacted, nice, rich soils that are continuous. You can run them continuous between multiple trees, and from larger soil volumes, we get larger trees faster and longer lived trees. Carbon sequestration downtown, getting high value, large canopy trees and all the benefits that come with it, reduced surface temperatures, stormwater disruption, stormwater capture via this huge volume of soil underneath the surface of the road or sidewalks. They're tremendously expensive, and developers don't want to pass along those costs to the unit owners.
They did that outside the police department, right?
Yeah.
They took trees out and they improved the area that the trees wouldn't be able to grow into and put new trees in, right? So
Yeah.
it has been done. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was when Cecil Kananadike was here, he showed a couple of examples of kind of mini parks. And one I think was in Italy where people were sitting outside, say their condo or something, and just there's a bench, and then just above them there was a little statue, and there was 2 or 3 trees, like a little diversity of trees, so you get the sense of being in a park almost there. And another place was in maybe Hong Kong, where some old people were so enamored of this little group of trees, just a little tiny group of trees in the sea where there's no trees anywhere, that had been planted in some kind of a planter, or 2 or 3 trees, and they were taking care of it, and they were meeting there. So it gives a place for people to get together. Where is that something that could happen here? Is anybody talking about that here? That mini park idea, like on Yates Street, where it's just concrete, or the new library in James Bay, concrete and huge sidewalk, absolutely huge, but nothing there much. It's living.
Yeah, a lot of this is, it's going to take all of us to break down norms in the community of design, landscape architecture, and how our values, our value systems that seem to have negative perceptions against large trees in urban spaces.
But they don't have to be that large.
They don't have to be large, yeah.
So it's more friendly.
And yeah, I've seen it. I've traveled to, most recently in Japan and China, and seen these little tiny areas of refuge and how people gravitate towards it. It's like a area where they can hit reboot, just as this tiny little natural influence can have such a cleansing effect and recharge your day.
So little trees like that in little groups sequester carbon, and that's not the only thing I think about. I know I've said that a couple of times.
Yeah.
But I think all plants do, take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think in those cases, the values are building on our capital to do bigger things in urban forestry, rebuilding people's trust in trees and need for trees. In those smaller spaces, it would not be all that costly to, or you couldn't imagine that the maintenance would be so extreme in those situations to get trees established, but there needs to be, the interest needs to come from the community. That's what it comes down to.
So that's how we can help.
Yeah.
One of the things, I go to the James Bay Neighborhood Association meetings, and one of the things that's really strong at those meetings is about trees. If some developer's gonna do something, everybody's, we gotta have trees here and there, and we've gotta have this much lawn, and it's really great because the developers, well, actually, I forget, there's one of them, I forget his name, but he comes and he really listens. And one of the things was along Michigan Street, and where the library is in the big building, and they were really concerned about, and he promised he would keep all those trees along Michigan Street. Anyway, it's really good because it's a forestful community, and they are forced to listen.
Yeah, and the more that the larger developers anyways encounter it, I think they're going to adapt their standard operating procedures. And I know that there's a couple of new large developments in the pipeline.
I think his name is.
Okay. There's some larger builds in the pipeline, in the planning pipeline, where the developer has signed on for these soil cells, which is fantastic. Like that's what we need to work towards, is getting more soil volume in these areas of density. From the city's perspective, we have these trees in the ground for much longer. The life cycle cost comes down the longer the tree is in the ground. It starts to provide benefits sooner. It's win-win. And establishing large trees in those areas is the hard part. Yeah.
What does it take to have the best success in planting a tree in a city lot, in a garden?
In a city lot, so on a private city lot, what does it take?
I'm going to put one in my front yard. And it's a difficult spot, so how do we make that more successful?
What makes it difficult?
Mhm. It's on a slope that's very dry and rocky. There was an oak tree there that had to be taken down. I'm still waiting for Senechal to come and get rid of the stump. Because that's another thing I want to know is if you plant another tree in, I'm thinking spruce, among other things. I want to get rid of the lawn. But is it best to leave those roots or the stump in, or is it better for the new tree to have it gone?
Well,
to start anything, and I've tried a couple things.
yeah, generally minimizing disturbance of the soils is best. I couldn't say without seeing the situation for myself, but if you can tolerate the idea of seeing the stump there, if the visual impact doesn't bother you, it will offer some anchorage benefits. And
I don't mind leaving it there. I
Yeah.
just want the tree to have the best chance because it's a difficult spot. It's not very much soil in this soil, and it's a rocky area, so it slopes down on soil on top of rock in there somewhere.
Arbutus, Gary Oak, Douglas fir.
Pardon me?
Arbutus, Gary Oak, Douglas fir.
Well, it's a Gary Oak area.
Yeah.
I haven't seen, Arbutus sounded like a good thing, but I haven't seen any in that area.
Can you repeat the question for them so that when they're editing?
Yeah.
So the question is getting a tree that's going to be viable in difficult growing conditions, recent loss of a Gary Oak beside it, whether to retain the stump, leave it in situ, or to grind it out to make way for the new plant. What species would work, and how to get it established, more or less. And yeah, I would lean towards some of our native species that perform really well in tough growing conditions, on slopes, shallow soils.
The problem is, and that's why I was kind of looking at spruce, because I want it more upright and spreading, and it's not a very big patch that it came out of.
The challenge with spruce and shallow soils is in, once they get established and get above the, basically surrounding trees and they're exposed to heavy winds, their soils are, their rooting systems are shallow and prone to just blow over in the winds.
That's good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, I would tend to avoid that on shallow soils. Yeah.
For shallow soils, what would you most recommend?
Gary Oak, Douglas fir, Arbutus.
Okay.
My favorites. Yeah, a succession of some of our native species that have been through a lot of adversity in the last little while through changes, like just recognizing we have some great trees and we're protecting the trees we have, hopefully. But some of them are going to age out. Some of them are going to become structural risks. And we just need to keep the succession of younger plants coming into the system. So we have something there lying in waiting, a contingency plan as the old trees need to be removed or reduced, and carrying that legacy on, because there's not many species that thrive in those kinds of conditions like these trees do.
What sort of depth of soil, if you get one that's been nurtured, when you plant it, what sort of depth of soil is best? And I don't quite understand about the length of the root radical and the planting process and what's needed to nurture it.
So question I'll repeat was what is ideal root or soil depth for establishing Gary oaks in this case, in consideration with this rapidly expanding root radical on a tap root with Gary oak. The more soil, the better typically. Soil conditions are good, soil depths, volumes are plentiful. It's going to get what it needs. It will also help it through harsh conditions, winter drought, summer drought, waterlogged soils.
What would be a minimum that you know, below which you would say, don't bother, not a good idea, do something else?
The minimum, I would say, soil volume before pulling the plug and looking at either a different site or a different species. It depends on the size of the planting stock. So if we're talking smaller stuff like I have on the table here, imagine this Arbutus, I would have no problem planting that on very thin soils at that size, so long as I could protect it from deer and provide water during establishment. The first couple of years are very important. Don't let that dry out for long periods of time because it'll be game over. But once it can establish roots and connect with what it needs, it's off to the races. Well, if I had Gary oaks sort of that size, if I could get it into the ground very young where it didn't have a very large root system as of yet, it would have much better chances of getting established than large planting stock, where you have a larger root ball and more demands on water and nutrient uptake for a larger biomass.
How do the roots actually work when there's rocky terrain?
Well, this is a perfect example, this one. You can see how most of the roots, the ones that are hanging down, they would actually be more out directly sideways. They're very shallow in the soil profile, most species. Oak will taproot, and it will establish some fairly deep roots, as will Douglas fir. But the majority of the water and nutrient uptake is this fibrous, the finer roots you see out here. And they'll be in the upper 45 centimeters of the soil profile.
If you're getting a plant from a nursery, is it similar to like bedding plant? Would you not break the roots up, kind of just ease the roots so they're not as pot bound when you plant it?
Yes, that's often missed. That's very important that you tend to any circling root conditions when you obtain the stock. You'll notice all of my root balls here are the only container plant that I root washed was this one, and it's only about 2 years old, so it hasn't established a great deal of circling root activity. But all these roots had kind of migrated to the bottom of the pot, and you'll get this circling right around the outside. And if you plant that tree in that condition, you're not going to establish anchorage. Those roots will continue to circle in situ in the hole you've dug, which is a bit of a double whammy. It's not able to access the water and nutrients beyond radially out from the pith of the plant. It's kind of stuck in situ, and it's not establishing anchorage. So these will get what they need and they'll grow and then they'll fall over.
So you're saying root wash. What does that entail?
That's, in this case, I've just washed all the soil away from the roots for the purpose of this demonstration.
To like separate the roots, or
That can be a really good way to go. You're keeping moisture in the root tips, the fine fibrous growth in particular, and it can help you identify stuff that might be hidden. With potted stock, Sometimes nurseries will, rather than deal with this root pruning as they pot up, they'll just leave the circling roots, and then you'll get another layer of them as it is able to reach the edge of the new pot, so you'll have like kind of a double layer thing. So if you don't probe, you may have some conditions that are going to be a setback potentially in getting the full lifespan out of your tree.
Question about Gary Oaks. Do you water them?
I do, not often.
Okay.
So I have, I share an oak with my neighbor. He has a very large oak in his backyard, and both of them, when it's really hot and we've gone a stretch without water, in the evening I'll go out and put water to both of them and give them a really good soak, sort of at least on one half of the radius of the drip line, as much as I can get water on it. You just want to see water start to actually puddle, and I'll do that, you know, once every week or every 2 weeks, even if it's really hot and really dry. But once it cools back down, I'm off of the water for the most part.
It's interesting because there's a Gary Oak that fell that was in front of the building where I live.
Yeah.
And I was told that it was the root ball was moist, and it was because it had been watered, because there was things planted around it. So those, you know, the flowers or whatever had been watered, and the root ball of the Gary Oak got saturated, and it just went.
Yeah, there's more layers to it than just that. Generally, where we see these issues occur, standing water or irrigation right at the root collar of Gary Oaks is never a good thing, but most of the issues lie in a combination of situations. So you'll have, say, a grade change from development. They'll pile a bunch of soil, raise the grade, which impacts established trees because roots need to exchange gases. They can no longer exchange gases. Roots die. Roots begin to decay, particularly larger roots. That's your anchorage. Decay spreads towards the root collar. Maybe there's a wound site on the lower trunk, the root collar of the tree. Decay meets between the tree and the roots. Now you have advanced decay at a structurally important area of the tree. So you can get these cascading effects from one event. It could be excavation injury, it could be a vehicle wounds it could be a grade change, as I mentioned. And then the water can just add insult to injury, where you already have roots no longer able to exchange gases from compaction, grade change, so on. Add water, it's creates perfect conditions for advanced decay.
There's 2 Gary Oaks still there.
Yeah.
And there's sawdust around the bottom of the trees. So there's a lawn, right? And then there's sawdust, and there's some plantings like heather or something. So I keep looking, I'm seeing if they're being watered or not, but I'm wondering how, you know, I think the sawdust buildup is fairly dense underneath the trees, and it's not, like the sawdust isn't just level with the ground, it's up here.
Yeah.
So that doesn't sound like it would be too healthy, I'm not sure.
Yeah, if you're seeing, it sounds like deteriorating sapwood, if it looks like almost like really fluffy mulch type of thing, yeah, you'd want to have someone have a close look at that. So it could be from a wounding event, it could be from dieback in that particular area, and then decay sets in. It's tough to say. There's many things that can happen, but the key message is give trees the best possible conditions to thrive, and they can overcome a lot of these issues while they're still minor. But cascading stress leads to, you know, eventually they just run out of gas, and then they're susceptible for decay advancing ahead of the tree's ability to compartmentalize it.
Is there any evidence whatsoever that it is more optimal to water tree that needs it in the morning or the evening, does it make no difference whether you do it at the beginning of the day or the end of the day?
With some species prone to foliar blights and so on, powdery mildew, these sorts of conditions, it's better to wait and early morning is best case scenario, so you don't have moisture standing on foliage over the evening, particularly in cooler, wet temperatures. It seems to be a problem. But apart from that, I mean, you shouldn't be watering the foliage of your trees anyways. It really would only occur when they're at establishment, younger trees. You're watering the soil. So the main thing is avoid the heat of the day, where most of the water is going to evaporate or roll off into the catch basins. So whichever is most convenient for you, I would say, is the right answer. When the tree is likely to get water. And in some cases, with trees at establishment, municipal crews are watering during the day, 8 till 4 o'clock, which is not ideal, but we'd rather they got some water than no water. If we risk losing some to evaporation or having that water roll off, so be it.
We're getting really close to having to wrap up.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to give Ryan the chance to, because you had a whole bunch to say.
You know, we've covered a lot.
Inundated you with questions.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of it, but you know, I'd be happy just to quickly run through like kind of my key criteria for success. Species and nursery selection. Number one, taking the time to examine branching, form. Nurseries will often try to manipulate the structure just by way of heading some branches to produce lateral branching. A short seedling shouldn't have much in the way of lateral growth. That comes later. That doesn't necessarily mean you have a desirable plant that's going to succeed. It means that it's been manipulated by the nursery for a better chance that you're going to buy it. That's not always the case, mind you, but looking for something that's free of wounds. If it does have circling roots, it's not a deal breaker for me, particularly if it's showing good vitality, there's very little dieback in the crown. It looks like it's kind of consistent growth, nice looking specimen. A little circling roots, no problem. Just get the hose out, spade prune it off is the easiest way. If you have like a hoary gardening tool or a root knife, you just want to saw away that circling material so you have radial growth directly outward. Container versus ball and burlap versus bare root. Bare root's very hard to find. You find it more with fruit trees, nut producing trees. These are all bare root. So I've washed all the soil off of them after I've excavated them out of the hole. They have an amazing ability to integrate quickly. They do require staking though initially. Otherwise they have no root weight. Staking.
Oh, right.
So otherwise it tips over quite easily. So they establish much quicker, I find, than container stock or ball and burlap. Ball and burlap, larger trees are like most of the stock we're planting for the city comes in ball and burlap, where they try and they pack in as much of the soil volume from the nursery as they can. Downside, well, I can lift this up and move it around with one hand. Ball and burlap is 2 people, a dolly, and a pickup truck, and it's heavy. It's hard work, and it takes longer for those trees to get established. Upside, you don't necessarily need to stake because there's so much weight in the soil.
And I thought it would be better. I would think it would be better to have some of their original soil, but you're saying that actually slows them down?
Yeah, it turns out it does. Yeah. Now, to an extent, there are cases where they've taken large mature trees bare root, believe it or not, and So long as they're supported and there's no movement, once they go in their new situation, they establish new rooting, and over time they can, you can fall down the rabbit hole on some of the experimentation going on with transplanting. But bare root has a great rate of success, I find, so long as the fine roots don't dry out, which I'm going to have to get these home. And they can stay just in mulch for storage for a couple of months, 3 months, no problem. So I can, it's not widely available yet, but it has a lot of advantages. Native species, you're not going to find much bare root. As I say, it's kind of narrowed to fruit and nut producing trees locally for what you're going to find. Where to plant? This is the bulk of it. The key takeaway is, I think, what is your goal ultimately? Do you know what your goal is with this tree? Like what are you looking for the function of this tree to perform? And it can be multiple factors. It can be providing refuge for wildlife, forage, perching, habitat, supporting restoration, improving soil conditions, more utilitarian purposes such as using the tree as green infrastructure for carbon sequestration, nitrogen fixing, stormwater disruption and attenuation, cooling and slightly shading the soil interface to allow species to thrive beneath. Other goals, placemaking. We talked about that tonight. Using trees. I can think of a couple of examples of private trees that have been utilized as a placemaking space. It wasn't intended, it wasn't planned, but it ended up being like, hey, this tree's really cool and people like hanging out here, so let's support that and put in a bench and so on. Trees are a great refuge and can be a great place in the community for meeting and drinking coffee, and it will grow from there. Other goals?
Food.
Yep.
Nuts and fruit.
Yep.
That's going to be more important.
Sorry but I think this is important in the urban context of placemaking. Are there some species which you would not advise because of possible root compaction, because of soil compaction being more detrimental to the health of the tree?
You said spruce, didn't you?
If the question is in relation to compaction of soils and ability for trees to thrive, yeah, there are species that seem to really struggle with compacted soils. If the situation was really tough, it was just a really harsh space, I can think of species to avoid in those types of situations. But it's really on a case-by-case basis. You need to get in and do the analysis work ahead of time, and in some cases you can modify it to an extent where a tree can be established even in those harsh conditions. So I wouldn't, I'm careful to issue like generalized statements of those situations without seeing more of the full picture. But compaction is like our number one, well, not our number one issue, but that's one of the number one stressors of urban trees. And it's all about providing good growing conditions so trees can overcome these issues. If we can avoid compaction, and even if we get a new tree established and we can somehow control compaction from that point forward, I think at development sites a lot of the time, if we can reduce the potential for compaction to happen via design, do it. Because that's going to mean we're going to have that tree in the ground for a much longer period of time.
What causes compaction? People walking over it?
Yeah, it's compression of soils, and it can come from a variety of ways. Foot traffic is probably number one. Some of the spaces within parks are incredibly hostile. and has impacts on bulk density of soils, and through that there are impacts to roots' ability to take up water and nutrients. They become unavailable in many cases. So establishing your goals as a baseline is really key. Having your eyes wide open, and number 2 is probably going to be taking a long, hard look at who is going to interact with your tree, who's going to be potentially impacted by your tree choice. There was one unlucky fellow that called and wanted to donate a tree, a giant sequoia actually, because just the mere presence of this thing arriving on his property triggered such a negative reaction from his neighbors that relations got very tense between them, and relations were good up until that point. And I love them, and they're just unbelievably strong, sturdy, long-lived, and adaptable. I'd love to see more of them, but trying to break down the stigma of the tree we've got some more work to do on that one. But just how other people are going to interact with it. In some cases, people hold their views dearly. They hang on to their negative perceptions of trees, and what about my gutters? What about my roof? What about who's going to pay for the maintenance? And what about my drains? And we can put a lot of those issues to rest, but they're tough conversations to have. So getting everybody on board with it, unfortunately, is a reality in this day and age in the urban context, and it comes down to education, showing them the data, showing them how it can benefit them. So that's a big challenge, warming them up to it, and maybe feeling out how are they going to feel about a tree going in the ground. Speaking for my own situation, which I can do as a resident, it's getting buy-in from your neighbors. They'd see me out in my garden all the time. They learned that I was really into trees and doing a lot of my own growing, and they knew I was into renaturalizing, and gradually we started having those conversations. Now we're at the point where each of them just take all their leaves and throw them over the fence into my yard. And now we've gone one step further, where we've, we had some major tree issues with one of their oaks, and I was able to provide them with preventative work. We installed a cabling system to make sure we had the tree for the long haul. And now they're growing camas, and they're doing some restoration work on their own properties. So it takes work, but it's worth it. Siting. Balconies, yeah. I'm not ruling anything out. Let's get the trees out there and let people interact with them, and the capital will build, and we'll be able to do bigger and better things. Thinking about siting, put it into terms of where is the least worst siting. Whatever you have to work with, it's never going to be where's the best siting. You're looking at all these conflicts. And as the spaces get smaller and smaller, the conflicts grow. Where is the least worst siting? Where's the best chance of this thing thriving? It's more about, in an urban context, it's more about placement than the soils themselves. We can address those issues. If it's not best case scenario, we can make adjustments with the species that are more adaptable to those situations. But first you need to imagine where this tree is going to go. And now we're thinking 4 dimensions, fourth dimension being time. The space that this thing's going to fill, year 5, year 10, year 50. And underground. So we have tools we can work with there as well, through root barriers. So we can direct away from, if you have an aging perimeter drain system, we can direct away from that to minimize impacts, and work with species that are less prone to interact with these older drainage systems where there's pore space, where there's water, where there's a perfect environment for roots to get established. Soil volume, can't say it enough. Bulk density, talking about compaction, avoiding compaction to begin with. Soil cells in the urban hardscape environment, where we maintain good bulk density, minimize compaction. We have continuous soils and a large volume of soil, so roots have more access to what they need: water, nutrients, minerals. Drainage, drought tolerance, providing irrigation in some cases, having a supply of water through establishment, and thinking about sun exposure. All good considerations. After establishment, your vital inputs are going to be water through establishment, year 1, year 2. During drought, do not overwater, do not underwater. Is that perfectly clear? Yeah. So if you see standing water tomorrow after watering in the evening, you've watered too much, let the soils drain, and adjust your application for next time. Mulch, can't say enough about it. Mulch is amazing stuff. Gives you basically insulation against cold temperatures for those fine surface roots, insulation against hot temperatures, retains moisture in the soil for longer periods of time, provides nutrient return, increases microbial activity, and establishes fungal networks. Pretty good stuff, and you can get it for free. Initial and establishment pruning, that's easy. Just any branches break or are dead, prune them off. Nothing more. That's it. After it's established, year 2, year 3, we can start getting into some training, formative pruning, to avoid defects. And the payoffs, you put in the care at establishment and you get big return on your investment. It's all about providing the best possible conditions you can, and the tree will overcome. It's amazing what they'll overcome. So that's
Wow.
the presentation.
Bravo. Thank you so much.
Yeah.